All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the intro. My name is Boris, and I'm gonna be talking about A/B testing today. And just one question: should I restart the screen recording? No, it's actually working still. Okay. Okay, that's fine. As I said, I'm gonna be talking about A/B testing today, and this is, I guess, the only lecture here that isn't from engineering. So, bear with me. There's not going to be any code or as many practical examples as in the previous lectures, but I hope to share some useful information to even you as developers when your PM comes with a request to actually implement an A/B test, so that you kind of know what to watch out for and what are kind of the best practices in setting up, and actually what happens behind the scenes when we kind of take the data and draw some conclusions from it. At kiwi.com, I'm the product manager in charge of the search experience on mobile and web. What that actually means is pretty much everything that happens from the moment when the user enters kiwi.com through finding their best flight with the search criteria that they have, and all the way through entering booking. So that's it about me shortly. And why am I even talking about this topic? So A/B testing, especially at Kiwi, is pretty important because it gives you the ability to actually make sure that what you're doing and the features that you're launching, that they're actually having the performance on the metric that you want them to have. The thing is, like with any kind of scale up or any kind of environment with a large volume of users, it's really tough to know what kind of impact whatever you launch is going to have. As I said, there's a ton of users, there's seasonality in place, there's even world events that can have a huge impact on what you're actually doing, which we at Kiwi really know something about. Which makes, like, if you launch something, look at before and after, it's kind of tough to actually attribute any of those changes to what you actually did. There's also various forms of user research. We at kiwi.com, we have our own user research team. But the thing is, user research can give you really good answers as to what's the motivation of user for doing something, what's their kind of thinking process, how do they perceive, for example, certain messaging, or how do they understand a certain feature. But it's really hard to get an answer to, would the user actually use this? And especially, would user pay for something? Because all the users are gonna tell you, yeah, that sounds really cool, I would use it. But when it's actually in production, it's not really the case. So A/B and multivariate tests, which are both kind of a similar thing, I'm gonna talk about it later, are essentially a tool which allow you to kind of better understand how really users interact with your features once they're in production. And they can actually increase your confidence in, when you actually roll out something, to know whether or not it's performing well. So what am I going to talk about today? So firstly, I'm gonna do a general quick intro to A/B testing as a method. Then I'm gonna go over an anatomy of like an example A/B test, just to kind of set the stage for later. And then I'm gonna go over some of the best practices in setting up A/B tests, which I've kind of learned over time, both in previous companies and at kiwi.com. And then at the end, kind of touch upon what the analysis looks like and what are we looking at when we're drawing some conclusions from whatever we see from the A/B tests actually performing. So, don't be intimidated by the wall of text here. I'm gonna try to kind of walk you guys through. So A/B testing is nothing more than validation method or a tool which essentially allows you to compare performance of two different variations of something in the app. It can be like a feature, so a different design of the feature. It can be different flow, arranged in a different way. It can even be an algorithm. For example, you can A/B test an algorithm that we're using for actually sorting the flights when you're searching for them, and so on, pretty much anything. And you compare then these two variations based on a certain metric, or most commonly even a set of metrics. There's also multivariate testing, and that actually refers to nothing more than just A/B tests with more than two variations. So you would have like a control variation, you would have, variation with one change, and then have another variation of that same variation, for example, just reshuffling the elements in some order, which is then used for when you have a hypothesis and you have actually multiple ways of solving an issue. You want to find out, okay, what's the best way to solve it? And as I said, like it's used to kind of find a local optimum of the solution that you have at hand. With both of these methods of testing, users are randomly bucketed into each of the variations, and they don't actually know that they're in an A/B test. And then once we do that, we use statistical analysis, various forms of it, which I'm going to talk about later, to actually draw some conclusions of what's happening. And the last quote here is, I believe, pretty important, because like with every tool, there's a famous quote, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when teams discover A/B testing, it can be pretty attractive to go ahead and A/B test everything. And that's fine. You can find out the performance of anything you want, but there's a couple of caveats there, and there are certain things which really make sense to A/B test, while there are certain things which can only provide you with additional engineering effort and also additional time to validate, but they're not actually that important to validate with an A/B test. And so that kind of ties into why you want to do A/B testing and what kind of changes are the best to A/B test. The most important thing here is that you can properly isolate the impact of a single change against everything else that you've changed. So it's often common with mobile in particular that you have some release train style of releasing, and at Kiwi there's multiple teams targeting the same release. And if we are to roll out something, we cannot confidently say, okay, our conversion rate is higher because of this change that we introduced, while booking is doing something, MMB is doing something, core is maybe doing some overall improvements, and so on. It also actually helps you to exclude any kind of factors that are seasonality driven, driven by changes in the user mix, driven by world events that I've already mentioned, and so on. Because just like pre-summer period, as in travel, can give you completely different data than like the winter period. Or I remember like working in education, our kind of back to school season was the high point, whereas the rest of the year behaved completely different. So this is something that you can actually kind of work around with A/B testing. As I also said, like this is a really good way to find out if users would actually use something if you put it in their own hands and don't have any moderation from your end. And lastly, detecting unexpected impact of changes. So often when you're launching something, you have like the primary metric you want to move, be it like the number of registrations, being the conversion rate, being the number of purchases, revenue, whatever. But you often don't know that a certain change that you make might have like maybe a negative impact to some other metrics, and it's really hard to do it without an A/B test. So when you're A/B testing, you just take, okay, give me all the users who've been exposed to this, and compare all the different types of metrics to the actual baseline, which doesn't have the feature. So it's pretty easy to kind of root cause that way. How do you do A/B testing? So there's a ton of tools available for it. There's generally like two approaches that companies use. You can either build something in-house or rely on some third-party tool to do it. There's of course pros and cons for both of these. Just speaking from experiences, I've worked with a couple of third-party ones and also working with some in-house ones at Kiwi. Like with in-house, it's the best thing is that you have like the complete control over the logic, the way the users are bucketed. It's often more efficient and faster in terms of performance as well. It doesn't introduce that much overhead because it's tailored to your specific system. And it's also perfectly adapted to other parts of the stack. For example, any kind of analytics you're reporting, if you have some custom stack there, you of course build the A/B testing tool around it. The con of in-house tools is that it's the entry price is kind of high, not the monetary. Well, it is the monetary price, but not the literal price tag, but the development time you need to invest to actually get it into a usable state. Yeah, I actually reversed these. So yeah, the upfront cost is high, and it's also not just the upfront cost. You actually need to maintain it over time for it to be usable. In terms of third-party tools, they are easy to integrate most of the time. They're usually easy to integrate for like the basic use cases. If you have like a really custom solution, it can kind of get into a way. Good thing is like you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Like somebody already solved all of the problems with bucketing, with splitting, with sample size mismatch for you. And you have like a really nice dashboard to control it, whereas like the internal tool usually, if you're lucky, you get some, HTML connected to some, JSON file that you're modifying. Sometimes you just edit directly and so on. There's no visualization or anything. A con of the third-party tool is, mostly in the fact that it's, third-party. It's an additional dependency that can break. They're pretty costly, actually, and also a big issue is that the logic is a black box. When you have an issue with bucketing, you need to, sit on a support call and get escalated through multiple tiers of support for them to actually discover that it's a bug on their side and that they need to prioritize it, and then you push them for a couple of months to prioritize it. Doesn't happen, and then you're looking for another solution, staying with it until it also breaks. And I think it's really important here to kind of note that whatever you select, like be it in-house or the third-party tool, it's not like a done story. You can A/B test and that's it. This really requires constant, reevaluation. Is our setup actually correct? Can we trust the metrics that we're seeing? And, constant maintenance of it to ensure that it's also following the development of other parts of the system. In terms of third parties, there's like a ton of them. I've kind of outlined some of which that I had the experience with here. There's like Optimize, like Templatex, Firebase. At Kiwi, we use Firebase, which is kind of a pretty basic one, in terms of the functionality that it offers. But, we do have our custom, kind of reporting stack that goes into BigQuery, which we use for kind of the full-on analysis. Firebase just controls the bucketing portion of it. So before I kind of dive into the analysis portion of the A/B tests and kind of the best practices, let me just give you like one kind of clear example of a change that's worth A/B testing. So we can get an example of you're building like some subscription-based application. You have a couple of subscription plans that you want to offer, and you have the hypothesis that by highlighting the 12-month subscription plan, you can drive more users to purchase it and thus increase your average LTV, which is lifetime value, and overall revenue that you're bringing in. Because from the data and also just intuitively, that it's kind of highest priced and it gives you the best LTV. And so you go ahead and set up variations of the test. So what you actually want to test against what. So you of course have the baseline variation, which is the control group, which doesn't have any kind of highlighting. And then you have the treatment group, which has the best value label shown above the 12-month plan here. In terms of targeting, this is also one thing you think about with every A/B test. For this example, you might opt to, okay, let's roll this experiment out to everyone. But when we're doing the analysis, let's really focus on the US as one group and then rest of the world as the other group, because from the data, that kind of the behavior patterns and the conversion rates are, there's US and that there's everything else, especially with, in-app purchases. And then you define the metrics that you actually want to look at. And this is what's really good about the A/B test, like this specific example, because you can look at, first, what's the conversion rate to purchase? How does it change when we add this kind of guiding the users towards 12 months into the mix? You can also look at average LTV, given it's a subscription app, how much do users renew on average? You can also look at the absolute revenue, because not all of the options, bring you in, the same amount of revenue. And you can also look at the distribution of what do users actually choose on this screen. What percentage of users opts for 3 months, what percentage of users opt for 12 months, and what percentage of users takes the lifetime plan. And so when you're actually running the test, the way it works, you have your traffic, and then you give 50% of the traffic to the control variation and another 50% of the traffic to the treatment variation. And you wait for around 2 weeks, so kind of 2 sales cycles to complete. And then you have your results. In this example, you could see that, okay, overall my conversion rate to purchase is a bit lower. But on the other hand, I'm seeing an increase in the average LTV because 12 months has higher LTV than 3 months, and of course lifetime, because lifetime is just a consumable that doesn't renew. Also, in terms of revenue, you can see an increase because the 12-month option is priced higher, plus taking LTV into account, it overall brings in a higher amount of revenue yield. When you look at the distribution of purchases, you can see, okay, 3 months and lifetime are a bit, decreased, but of course we can see an increase in the 12-month purchase. And so when you connect your original hypothesis, okay, I want to guide more users into 12 months by adding best value, kind of evaluating all of the factors, you can make a decision, okay, is the maybe conversion rate hit that I see worth it in order to have the higher LTV and higher revenue, and is this distribution of purchases, also kind of worth it to me. So this is like just one example of an A/B test. In terms of kind of best practices, these are kind of easier to understand if you have an example. The first and the most important one is when you're A/B testing, have a single and a really clear hypothesis of what you want to validate. The reason for this is like if you're changing like 5 things on the purchase screen, let's say we added the label, we changed the color, we added one more option, we run it as an A/B test, we didn't find anything out. Like, we can see like positive or negative impact on conversion, but we don't know what's actually driving it, which one of those changes. When you're running the test, it's, you always need to compare the hypothesis to some kind of a control group, and that's usually baseline, meaning the current experience. If you change the baseline and run the test then, it's not really relevant because you're comparing the new experience also against the modified experience. So this is also something to watch out for. The third one, make sure that you can actually measure all of the metrics and also eligibility, which I'm going to touch upon a bit later. This one's pretty important. We kind of take it for granted. Okay, everything's going to work, but it really needs to be checked, both by engineering, QA, and ideally by PMs, to just see, are we actually seeing data that we want to see from this A/B test. Fourth one, allocate the same amount and profile of traffic to all of the variations. This is really important. So if you're running, let's say this last A/B test, you don't want to, distribute like 20% of the users to the control group and like 80% of the users to the treatment group, because then you're comparing like apples and oranges. It's not even just about the absolute figures. It's, whichever group you take. Let's say you take like all of the users from the US. By allocating 20% to control, those 20% might have like less users who are less likely to convert, or even like higher concentration of users that are more likely to convert than the other one, and so on. That's why it's kind of it's ideal to get as close as possible to like an equal split. In terms of profile, that's what I'm also saying. Like, it doesn't make sense to run an A/B test where the control group is received by one locale and the treatment group is received by a whole another locale, because you're comparing 2 different groups of users there. Avoid running multiple tests on the same audience. So this is maybe not always the case. You sometimes have multiple tests which cannot have any kind of negative interactions with each other. But still, for like the clarity of results, it's best to run, best to have the single audience receive a single A/B test, because when you get into like even 2 A/B tests, you can have a combination. Okay, one user receiving control of one and a treatment of other. One user receiving the treatment of the first one and the control of the other one, and you get the point. You have to worry about multiple permutations, which may not end up being equally sized, which is also a big problem in analyzing the data. The sixth one, this is, when you have like some features that depend on a certain feature being available or not being available, or any kind of deep links and so on, it's important to think about any edge cases that might arise as a result of, some part of users having this feature in the A/B test and some not. Like if you send a deep link, for example, that leads to a certain place in the app, which is under an A/B test, it might be an issue that, a user who doesn't have it receives some messaging about it. They open up link, nothing happens to them, and then they're left wondering about, okay, what's happening? Is the bug on my side and whatnot. And the last one, it's also connected to kind of thinking about the hypothesis. It's really worth to test A/B test stuff which can realistically receive enough traffic to achieve statistical significance. And I'm going to talk about statistical significance a bit later. The thing is, you could test like wording on some menu item somewhere in settings. But if you see that like only 2% of users are ever going to get to that flow, and you split that traffic in half and make like a slight change, it's really hard to get any kind of significance on those results. So A/B testing works the best on like really high traffic flows, where even the small changes can make a big difference. For example, any kind of purchases, the way you communicate information, and so on. In terms of actually analyzing A/B tests and drawing conclusions from them, like how do we approach it? So usually kind of this part is under a black box, like, developers develop something, QA, actually gets it approved to go into production. We run it, and then, PM comes back in 2 weeks and saying, okay, we need to promote it. There's, higher conversion. But what actually happens, behind the scenes? Firstly, when we're running the A/B test, we need to allow enough time to get, enough samples to draw any conclusions. Meaning that you often need to sample for seasonality. It's an issue if you, for example, run some A/B tests for like 3 days of the week, and you draw conclusions based on those 3 days, whereas the weekend might have like completely different customer behavior, which is often the case, for example, in travel. So the tip there is always to kind of either run it for like 1, 2, 3 weeks, any kind of multiple of that. So your sample, so you make sure that you don't conclude the test on like the really low point, or even worse, on some peak where you're seeing, a huge uplift in conversion, whereas over the weekend, it might drop with another kind of user behavior coming in. Second one, analyze only the users who are actually bucketed into the variations, meaning that you only take the users who receive the control and on variation and who didn't have any kind of errors happening in the bucketing process, because that can happen. The third one, and this one's really usually kind of troublesome to explain, but it's really important. It's to analyze only the users which are eligible for the test, meaning only the users who've realistically been able to be exposed to the A/B test. And I'm going to give an example a bit later on this. Of course, check if all of the variations, the way they're set up, if they're receiving roughly the same amount of traffic, usually shooting for the difference that's less than like 1 or 0.5%. Of course, depends on the absolute figures you're seeing, but this is something that I kind of always keep in mind. And then, after this kind of sanity check is done, we check all of the primary metrics that we're tracking and whether or not they're statistically significant. I'm also gonna, talk a bit more about that later. And besides the primary metrics, you also want to check on any counter metrics that you're checking and also their statistical significance. Because, for example, you might have an A/B test where you're really looking to motivate users to sign up and like bombarding them with sign up pop-ups or anything, but it might actually be hurting some other parts of the flow, like even purchases or engagement or whatever, or maybe turning some users down. So on the eligibility point, I'm gonna give a real world example of this. I don't know if Spotify A/B tested it, but it was like an easy example for me to explain this with. So I don't know how many of you are using Spotify, but you've probably seen, especially if you listen to podcasts there, that they've added kind of this badge, which is highlighted if they detect, I guess, that a certain podcast or a song or whatever is talking about COVID, in order to drive, I guess, more kind of attention towards users. And so you as a product manager want to see, okay, how does this banner being displayed here, how does this affect even users' willingness to go into a certain item when they don't have it and when they do have it. So kind of the easy approach here is, okay, let's take all the users who are in the experiment and look at the performance in off and on. But what you're doing there is you might be including into the analysis all of the users who might be searching or entering artist details, but that haven't actually encountered this kind of a highlight. Like they're still seeing items, they're still engaged and so on, but they haven't actually been exposed to the experiment. And having these kind of users in the mix actually pollutes your data, introduces additional noise from the users who are not relevant to you. So to avoid this, what you might do is, each time a user scrolls this kind of banner into their viewport, you report an event that says, okay, this user is eligible for this experiment. They've been exposed to the treatment. And it's important to report this in both of the variations of the experiment. So in the control group and also in the treatment group. So in the control group, you're not displaying the banner, but you're acting, okay, if I was displaying a banner, would the user see it? And then you report the event. In the treatment, they're actually seeing it, and you report the event. That enables you, when you're pulling up the data, to say, okay, give me all the users who would have been affected by this banner, and break them down by whether or not they're seeing the banner. So you can really see, okay, for these users, what's the impact, without the other ones polluting the data. Also, a note on statistical significance and why it's really, really important to whatever you're doing with A/B tests. So statistical significance, in short, it's used to determine whether or not the results that you're seeing could be a result of just random chance and behavioral data, or is there actually something making a difference here? So you can see, kind of this visualization here, and if any of you have had, statistics in college, you probably, covered this. But, what happens is, you start with a null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is basically saying that, whatever you're seeing, it's a result of, random chance. And if the p-value that you are observing, meaning, the error value, which is measured from 0 to 1, is, showing less than 0.05, meaning less than 5%, you can say that, okay, there is like less than there is 5 or less % chance that the null hypothesis is actually true, meaning that the data that we're seeing is a result of just random chance. And so, the industry standard is using the confidence level of 95, so that's 95% of chance that the observed value of the performance of the A/B test is gonna lie within the confidence interval, that it's not gonna be due to random chance. And it's important to know that even with 95, that doesn't mean that your A/B test is always gonna perform in a positive way. Sometimes it's gonna be maybe neutral or negative and so on, depending on the confidence interval actually. It's also important to know that methods for calculating statistical significance differ based on what you want to calculate it for. It's mainly kind of divided into whether or not you're measuring a binomial metric or a non-binomial metric. An example of a binomial metric is any kind of like conversion rate, for example, whereas a non-binomial metric is, for example, revenue or average revenue per user and so on. It's possible to calculate for both, but of course it's a different method. And yeah, so in short, kind of what we've covered today. I've given you, some quick intro to what A/B testing is and when it makes sense to do. Went over the kind of the rough anatomy of a sample A/B test, and went over some of the best practices you might want to do when setting up an A/B test, as well as how we usually approach the analysis and drawing conclusions from it and what's important there. And yeah, that's it from me. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot. Yeah.
Does some automated browsing, either crawling or scraping, represent a problem for this?
Yes, I mean, it generally represents a problem not only for A/B testing, but also for any kind of reporting you have in place, because like A/B tests are just relying on whatever reporting infrastructure you have in place, and if it's affected by crawling, then A/B tests are also reported by impacted by crawling. Like what you could hope for is that all of the variations of the A/B test are equally affected by it, and then any kind of relative change could be attributed to real user behavior, but you can't know for sure about it. Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned that Firebase is like, when looking from the perspective of A/B testing, really bare bone, really simplistic, and some other examples. Can you probably compare it with the other tools, what they can achieve, or whether they will be beneficial for us?
Look, so the other tools, I'm not gonna give two specific examples, not to be salesy, but I know that other tools offer you functionality like exclusion groups, meaning that you can say, okay, I want to roll these 5 A/B tests out, but make sure that each one of them is receiving a whole different group of users, meaning that the group of users are mutually exclusive, so you don't run into a problem of multiple A/B tests on the same audience. I know that some of them even have a functionality where you can run an A/B test and modify some part of the app, like strings or colors or something, without any kind of code changes. That sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, but it's really cool to make ad hoc changes without waiting for the whole release cycle to end. I think Taplytics in particular has that one. You can also report they have just more functionality for visualizing data, the dashboards, and generally A/B test management on scale. It's kind of easier with other tools. But the primary functionality of just bucketing users, it's usually the same between them.
Okay, thanks.
I would ask a question. So this is the first talk about A/B testing I attend, so I'm new to this. I assume that when you're bucketing users, that means that you are selecting which group of users is getting which version of the app. Am I correct?
Yeah, so bucketing is essentially, okay, I have this user, which experience does he receive? Yeah.
So do you construct the buckets based upon some profiles associated with the user? Meaning there is a user who bought 20 tickets in past year, and I want same amount of those users in both groups.
So yeah, the question was, I remember this now. So the question was whether or not we always kind of roll out to any kind of random users, or do we sometimes focus on a particular cohort of users? The answer really depends on what you want to test. Sometimes you might have a feature that's really interesting to really engaged users. So you say, okay, give me all the users who have more than X bookings, or have been using the service for more than X amount of time, or have spent more than X amount. You take that cohort and then split it into variations for testing. So you're targeting really the group that it's kind of the specific group, but you still have equals to compare between the variations.
Yeah. I'm sorry, my question is
Okay.
continuing because
Okay.
I really want to ask
Sorry?
about privacy issues. So the continuation of my question is, if you use third-party software, I assume they are constructing new profiles of users based on their data. So if you are using Google, you can also check, I don't know, I want males in this age group, Do you use such a profiles? No.
Yeah, to be honest, yeah, the question was on like the privacy concerns and whether or not some of these tools can actually pull in data about a user that's not directly a part of the application that we're dealing with. To be honest, in terms of A/B testing, like I don't know a functionality where I could, okay, this is like a Kiwi user, pull up everything, about him, even some stuff outside of our ecosystem. I don't know if that's kind of what you're asking.
I didn't mean that you are pulling the data, just selecting the group when we are constructing the bucket.
Okay, yeah, if you don't have access to data, like you cannot do it. Like you're limited to just the data that you have within your own ecosystem. And whatever you're using for bucketing, and whatever information you're collecting, there's laws and regulations, specifically GDPR, about, what kind of consent do you have to get from users to actually track them and how you need to communicate it.
Yes, and
yeah.
That's the final part of my question. Whether the push from especially Apple for user privacy is being observed in the results of the A/B testing, whether there is some impact on variables you are not able to measure anymore.
Yeah. So the question is whether or not the push for privacy, specifically coming from Apple, where they really ask you to opt in to any kind of tracking, or for that matter, everyone's kind of moving towards that point, affects it. Yes, it definitely affects it. I'm probably not the expert to talk about, kind of the technical side of it. I know that there are certain solutions which don't rely on kind of the old methods, which were kind of the main motivation of why Apple actually blocked this. There is gonna be a certain way to identify, users when they're moving throughout the app and what you're doing. But yeah, it's getting harder, especially I would assume for like marketing attribution. And even stuff like ad blocks can kind of skew the image of what you're getting in the data, depending on how you report it. So, yeah. Those are all things to watch out for, Yeah.
It is again continuation to this topic. So, if you want to test on a specific cohort that that is active, for example, and you are using Firebase to create the buckets, you need to provide from Kiwi. You need to provide the IDs of the users that you want to be in the cohort, correct? So
you can use certain criteria, like certain property needs to be set to a certain value for the user to be in an A/B test, not necessarily like a raw IDs. That's at least how I understand it working,
Yeah, so it's very technical. I'm just wondering how are the groups created if there is this precondition of having this attribute.
Yeah, look, with most of the tools here, what you're doing is you're reporting some set of attributes and events to that particular tool. So you can then use those events and attributes to say, okay, I'm gonna run this A/B test to all of the users who have the number of purchases to this value. They've been logged in the last week, and so on.
Yes, but to this you need to provide these attributes to Firebase, to the...
Yes. Or to any tool. They all kind of function in a similar way. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the isolations of A/B tests. So just a little bit of background. I work in ancillaries. We have close to 8 features with multiple PMs, which means any kind of presentation change, just like you showed in your slides, tiny little batch should be A/B tested because it could have impact. And since ancillaries are the primary source of revenue, it's highly sensitive. But from an engineering standpoint, it's like when you said the test needs to run for a long enough time, there has to be plenty of traffic, which means how does the A/B test keep up with, let's say, steady deliveries from the engineering side? So for example, develop a feature, it's 2 coding days, but then it has to run for 2 weeks at least for evaluation. But in between, we're working on the feature that should run for 2 weeks as well, and so on and so forth. So you have this queue of A/B tests that you need to evaluate somehow. And what's even worse than that, they have the same primary metric, which is conversion. So I guess we could run them concurrently, but then the evaluation table grows, what's it? If it's binomial, then
Yeah.
it's 2 to the power of running tests.
Yeah.
And then you have to like cross, okay, if A/B test A is on, but A/B test B is off, but A/B test C is on again, this is the best performance. I guess it's a mess of analyzing the data.
Yeah.
The question is it even possible? Have you tried that running concurrently 2 A/B tests? Is it doable or is it just hard?
So yeah, the question was essentially, just kind of usual issues with, dev teams with high throughput and a lot of different features. And, it being like a really high risk area of the flow, the need for A/B testing and what happens when the queue has like 15, 20 A/B tests in line, which all need to run for multiple weeks. So the question was around, do I have any experience with running them concurrently? So, you mean together on the same traffic or?
Yes.
Yeah, so I do have experience with it, but as I said, like, you can do it, but you really, really need to be sure that those 2 tests, in whichever, variation the user might end up in, don't have interactions with each other. For example, let me give you like an example of the homepage. Like it could be realistic to run an A/B test which changes some wording in the footer to see if users are gonna click more onto it, and to change something, for example, in the search form. Because those 2, realistically shouldn't have, touch points. But changing something, for example, in the place picker, and also something in the date picker is very risky because it's all a part of the same user intent to actually search. To your question, for ancillaries in particular, I know about the issue. It's tough. It's all a part of the same flow. It's really, really high interactions. The only thing that you can do is like, get more traffic, which is not a thing you just, go ahead and do. It's, obviously based on our, performance and the customer demand and everything. The second thing is to really reevaluate what you're A/B testing. And does it really, really make sense to A/B test? Could it be just before and after analysis and so on? Or maybe even bundling a couple of hypotheses that are closely related together into a kind of a bigger bet and A/B testing it. There's no other science to it. Like you need traffic. That's it.
You mentioned that other tools has some exclusion groups. Shouldn't that be a solution?
Yeah, so the question is like exclusion groups. That's essentially allowing you to run multiple tests but with different traffic. That's cool. That can solve the problem. But let's say you have like 100K users. You run 5 A/B tests, each one receiving 20K users. You split up, within each of those tests to 10K users, and let's say the conversion rate is 1%. All of those tests are then gonna take like a super long time to finish. Like what you said, it's like the power of, so it's hard. Plus, there's another caveat there. Like if you have an A/B test that's receiving like 10% of the whole traffic, and then you're splitting that up into 2, then it's a question of whether or not you're even getting representative audience. Because you're testing a hypothesis of a really, really small sample of the whole group that's coming in, which might be completely random. You might get like 5% of users where most of the users are like really low intent, kind of unlikely to convert. And then the other group was like, high spenders or something. It's more risky the deeper you get. That's why companies like Netflix or Facebook, who are famous for A/B testing, they have a ton of traffic to test it on. They can take even like some really, really specific cohort of users who are in more than 10 groups and are really engaged and split that up into like 5 tests, because they have the luxury of traffic. But the deeper you get into the flow, it's tougher. And yeah, ancillaries is kind of in the middle there.
So all we need is more traffic.
Or larger.
Yeah.
Just a follow-up. You mentioned seasonability.
Seasonality, yeah.
Seasonality, yeah. Well, and you also mentioned that travel is especially susceptible to it. There's differences between work week and weekends. So is it even possible to run before-after tests in case of Kiwi?
That's a good question, depending on where you want to run it. In terms of running it on purchases, not the best idea probably. But some other part of the flow, which is not susceptible that much to seasonality, like you're testing out some sharing functionality, for example, that could be doable as a before and after. Are we up with time? Or?
Yeah, like also I wanted you to repeat the question. But
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
Ask when you are like setting the A/B test on mobile, are you basically implementing the A/B test only for one platform, and then you are checking the results, and then the decision is okay, let's roll out to full traffic and also implement it to the other platforms, or are you implementing like the one A/B test on both platform and checking the behavior separately?
So the question was like when we're running A/B tests on mobile platforms, do we like first test something on Android, and if it performs well, we roll it out on iOS, or do we kind of test it at the same time? That really depends on the feature and the capacity and the priorities that we have. What we usually try to do is use only one platform for A/B testing something, because if it's gonna fail, let's not waste like two engineering teams' time to develop it if it's gonna be just switched off. Then there's also like something might perform well on Android, but that same thing might fail on iOS just because of the different type of users that are actually using both of the platforms, and so on. So it really depends. So if we're really sure that something is like it's gonna perform well, we've tested it on web, for example. We don't see any reason why it shouldn't perform on mobile, and we see no variance between both of the platforms. Okay, let's develop it on both and measure it at the same time. Well, depends. Yeah. I feel like a lot of the answers are depends, but yeah.
Can you maybe share with us what was the most surprising thing you find out from A/B testing, at least to you?
Yeah, so the question was whether there was any kind of surprising results of A/B tests. So the tricky one with this, I know examples in my head, but I don't know like how much I can actually share. But from both like Kiwi and other stuff I've done. But what I'm gonna say is that there's always certain things which you're sure, okay, this must work. I remember at the previous company, we had like this super old gray looking purchase screen, which looked really, really unappealing. And then we did like a variation of it, with colors, with graphics, with, value propositions, GIFs of what you can do in the app and so on. And it performed worse than the old gray one. Also, I remember one example from, and this wasn't in the app. This was actually in the Google Play listing. We had some really, really old screenshots in there with, for now when you open up an App Store listing, people really invest effort into presenting the screens, value props, and so on. These are like really old, the wrong format, everything. We tested like 15 variations, and not a single one managed to outperform. We didn't have the hypothesis for it. A lot of things dealing with like design, something like value propositions, especially like often you list all these great features that the app has, and it turns out users don't really care about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you running the tests basically only in like English from the start, or are you really like localizing to the other markets and check basically every market?
So the question was whether or not we just run A/B tests in English or localize them to other markets and then slice per market. The answer to that is also depends. Usually a lot of the changes that we do, the hypothesis is that it can bring some gain as a result of all users using it. So we try to localize it, and then once we're analyzing the test, we slice it like per market to see if the performance differs somewhat. But there might be some features which are really in the MVP stage where you might just want to test on like a specific market, because it's been designed for that market. I remember a couple of initiatives that we only like rolled out to the US because that was our primary one. Then once we see that, okay, let's then worry about all the other stuff, because there's also legal in play and so on. Really depends, Thank you.